The Forgotten Girls of Matinicus Island, the dangerous truth after the storm. On Matinicus Island, an isolated patch of land off the coast of Maine, where thick fog swallowed the old docks and the tide roared like an echo of the unforgiven. There once stood a convent, hidden behind a wall of grey stone. It was by no means grand, just a two-story slate building with a low dome, a leaning cross before the main door, and a seaweed garden so unusually neat it was as if someone had measured every footstep. The people on the mainland called it St. Bridget's Orphanage, but in the whispers around the fish markets at dawn, they had another name for it, the Nursery for Soulless Children. No one ever explained what was kept there, only that no one ever came back. From 1890 until its quiet closure in the winter of 1925, St. Bridget's Convent on Matinicus Island operated as a moral reformatory for girls labeled as incorrigible, immoral, or unfit for the public education system. At least, that is what the diocesan records left behind. But the weathered ledgers, the sterilization forms, discovered in a rusted safe, and a discovery deep beneath a strip of rotted sand after a high tide. They told a different story, a story of forced labor, of experimental sedatives, and of eugenics programs conducted with the tacit approval of the state of Maine. And what you are about to hear is not fiction. This is history. Only the names have been erased. This is what happens when the concept of purity is industrialized and young girls become statistics in someone else's dream of salvation. If this is your first time with us, welcome. We tell the stories the world has tried to bury, quietly, completely, and without sensationalism. If you appreciate that, please subscribe. Leave us a message. Let us know where you're listening from, because these places, they may sound distant, but they were built right in the heart of America. Now, let's return to the spring of 1890. The Maine coast had just escaped a harsh winter. The cliffs were still crusted with white salt, and the winds from the Atlantic still clawed at the windows like fingernails on glass. The seaside chapels were full. Local newspapers preached of righteousness, and County Judge Robert A. Callahan, he signed off on the first official case to be transferred to St. Bridget's Orphanage. Record number M1, Lisette Quinn, age 14. Offense: prolonged moral inhibition and refusal to recite prayers. The girl had no surviving relatives. She had once been caught singing alone on the rocks before being baptized. That was enough. St. Bridget's was founded by the Society of St. Isidora's Reformatory Sisters, a Catholic charity quietly funded by the state of Maine, and later by the Portland Foundation for Genetic Biomedical Research, a name you will not find in any official history. The convent was run by a woman named Elara Bonn, a former post-war nurse, revered by the society as a symbol of compassionate discipline. Elara wore only ash-gray robes and often spoke of washing the depravity down to the very last cell, and she was not alone. The staff included an unlicensed doctor, a German chemist hired to stabilize temperaments by formulating reformative solutions, and two nuns who had not taken their final vows, Sister Miriam and Sister Constance. They were responsible for overseeing piety and order in the dormitory. They all lived within the convent. No one else was permitted to step past the stone gates by the sea cliff. To the public, St. Bridget's was a resounding success. Bulletins from the parish church praised the quiet modesty of the girls brought back to the mainland, having become devout and fit for service in Catholic homes. Rare photographs show young girls mending nets, stacking prayer books, and folding their hands to read the Bible in perfectly straight rows. But what no one saw were the bruises hidden beneath ribboned collars, the sudden, unexplained fevers, and the silences so long they were soundless. In 1952, a team of coastal geological surveyors, in an effort to reinforce the foundation against erosion, discovered a rusted sewing box deep beneath a sand dune at the edge of the old seaweed garden. Inside were 8 scrolls of linen, hand-stitched with thread the dark red color of sea salt. Each scroll contained fragments of rotted paper, handwritten names, crude drawings, and disjointed thoughts. They were unsigned, but one sentence was repeated relentlessly. They called us the rotten moss. Soil analysts later confirmed. The sand in that area contained unusually high levels of mercury nitrate and neurodepressive alkaloids, a soil not meant for planting, but for forgetting. So, what happened here? How did a reformatory convent become a genetic experimentation facility? How did these engraved memories come to be hidden in the sand, mixed with rotting oyster shells? And why did the state continue to quietly fund this place for nearly 2 decades, even after multiple deaths were recorded simply as failures in reformation? To answer that, we will have to follow the paper trail, the local court sentences, the coded lists of dispensed medications, the censored letters sent from the island to the mainland, and one girl who tried to record everything before her voice was taken from her. Her name was never entered into any admission ledger, but she left behind something the tide could not wash away: a large seashell, carved with a rusty nail, buried deep beneath the roots of a dead salt bush. On it were 5 words, the strokes trembling but sharp: "Do not sow what can scream." In 1889, the Maine state legislature passed an act. It was called the Coastal Moral Reform Appropriations Act. This act allocated state funds to religious institutions, providing instruction in domestic arts and coastal labor for young women at risk of moral decline from the ages of 9 to 18. On paper, it was seen as a post-Civil War effort to combat poverty, juvenile delinquency, and the loss of feminine standards in a society transitioning to an industrial age. But, hidden deep in the text's language, was a fatal loophole. No one defined what "at risk of moral decline" meant. That meant any girl could be committed. And that is when the Society of St. Isidora's Reformatory Sisters stepped in. Founded in 1886 by Veronica Bellamy, the widow of a fishing captain and a fervent Catholic from Rockport, the society began as a moral auxiliary group, distributing pamphlets denouncing licentious lifestyles in port towns. But within 3 years, it had expanded into what a surviving internal handbook called A Movement for the Restoration of Lost Femininity. Veronica was not alone. The society's board included the wife of a Maine Supreme Court justice, the daughter of a doctor associated with Bowdoin Medical School, and the 2 sisters of a Jesuit bishop. They were all committed to one ideal: to cultivate future devout wives through structured discipline. They were not cruel, at least not in the way most of us imagine cruelty. They believed they were saving the girls. They believed that disobedience was contagious, that trauma could be expelled with labor and medicine, and that women who refused to submit were a genetic threat to the foundations of society. This was not just faith. This was early American eugenics, hidden in cassocks and old leather gloves. By 1890, the Society of St. Isidora's Reformatory Sisters had secured full funding to build St. Brigid's Orphanage, a pilot facility for what, in internal correspondence, was discreetly called a piety positioning convent. According to letters discovered in a locked file cabinet in 1993, the convent was designed as a living experiment for 3 hypotheses. Could disobedience be extracted from the female form? Could sterilization be justified if it took place under the guardianship of nuns? And could society reduce future burdens by purifying girls now? Publicly, the society still held fundraising tea parties, issued small prayer books, and promoted reformation through compassion. But behind the closed stone doors of the convent, they spent money on sedatives, on iron wrist restraints, and on mercury-based preparations absorbed through the skin. An invoice dated April 1892 reads simply, 8 doses of cognition, weakening solution for subjects unfit for matrimony, to be used in rotation in the algae cultivation area. Ilara Bon, the convent supervisor, wrote monthly reports to the board in Rockport. A few of them have survived. One handwritten report states, 2 girls hemorrhaged after the 2nd dose. One has been transferred to the mainland on schedule. The other is now quiet. Her posture is much straighter. Another reads, we tested the new solution mixture during the psalm singing hour. The slow response rate pleased the doctor. He believes docility can be made permanent within a week. One society member, Mrs. Hester Crane, proposed a commemorative gift to be sent to families instead of returning the girl. A small box would be mailed, containing something seemingly comforting: a sea blue ribbon, a cross-stitched Bible verse, or a lock of hair tied with beeswax. Never with a letter, never with an explanation. By the end of 1896, more than 160 girls had passed through the stone gates of St. Brigid's Orphanage. Only 43 were recorded as having been officially discharged. The rest were marked as transferred, returned to original care, or simply no longer suitable for reformation. No graves were recorded in the records. No headstones bore their names. But the sandbanks by the convent's western wall, where salt bushes and wild algae grew thick, always seemed overly fertile after each tide receded, especially after the first salt frost of the year. And there was one more thing. In 1897, a deliveryman named Clinton Morse left a note in his logbook after refusing to carry another crate of hymnals. He wrote, "Doesn't feel like books, too heavy, sounds like liquid inside, smells like vinegar and something sweet. They said it was rosewater. I won't be going back." He died in 1926 at a veterans' hospital in Augusta. When his relatives opened his wooden chest, they found a cross-stitched piece of cloth, folded neatly and sewn at the edges. On it were 3 words: "They feed us lies." She arrived on Matinicus Island in the spring of 1890, carrying a brown leather satchel, a vintage medical journal, and a book of psalms marked with red ink in the margins. Ilara Bon, 48 years old, a widow, childless, a former nurse at a field hospital near Portland. She had no formal theological training, yet was celebrated by the society as the embodiment of Christian discipline. To the girls at St. Brigid's Convent, she was known simply as the supervisor. Her philosophy, never officially published, was later found scattered in copies of the house rules, embroidered on tablecloths, and recited during orientation hymns. She called it the doctrine of the proper tide. A metaphor, she claimed, was revealed to her in prayer during high tide. The girls, she said, were streams trapped in the wrong currents, bending, overflowing, carrying toxic silt. The world had set them astray, the cities, their families, and their burgeoning desires. But if they were calmed, cooled, and drained under control, they could become clear water. Except for a few, she warned, who were reef rock, not meant to be bent, only to be submerged. In an undated scrap of paper, she once wrote, "God made 2 types of water, the shallow that can be filtered and the bottomless abyss. The first can be channeled, the latter must be sealed. Do not try to water a garden with salt water." Ilara did not classify the girls by age or circumstance as the records required. She classified them by something she called their soul sediment index, that is, their capacity for submission. Seafoam, the pliable, fearful children who obeyed from the very first night. They were considered suitable for regeneration, with the potential to become model housewives later on. Undertow, the sullen, intelligent girls with a tendency for disobedience. They did not resist openly, but fought back internally. They were given daily sedatives. They slept in the stone rooms of the basement and were not allowed to make eye contact with the sisters. Reef rock, the children who challenged authority, who talked back or stared at the crucifix as if challenging the Virgin Mary. There was a case of one who scratched her own blood onto her bedboards. These children were classified as morally sterile, meaning unreformable. They were not put to work, not allowed to participate in prayer, never spoken of a second time. No one ever saw a reef rock girl past her first week on the island. Their names were struck from the residence ledger. Their beds were cleared. The cloth patches, embroidered with their names, were removed and burned. Some said they were given back to the sea, but no one ever witnessed it actually happen. Ilara established a strict regimen. She called it the 3-threshold purification. Every girl new to the island had to undergo 3 stages. The wave calming, 72 hours of complete isolation, no talking allowed, no mirrors, no writing paper. They were fed only thin gruel and diluted tonics. The only sound they were allowed to hear was the recitation of psalms, which took place regularly at the lowest tide of the day. The salt labor, 7 days of continuous work in the salt marsh behind the convent. The girls were assigned to carry salt from wooden troughs, dry oyster shells, and crush seaweed, always barefoot, regardless of the winter or the skin-cutting sea wind. Any behavior that broke the line was noted in the sediment log. M. The Night of Refinement, a mysterious purification ritual that took place in the stone chapel, a place with no windows, lit only by blue oil lamps. No one knew what happened inside. Only Sister Agnes, who was mute, was allowed in and out. After the ceremony, the girl's behavior would be re-evaluated and reclassified. No photographs survive from the Night of Refinement, but according to the testimony of 2 survivors, the only ones who ever spoke out in old age, the ritual involved a high-backed wooden chair, a blindfold of thick cloth, and a machine with a spinning wheel that emitted a whirring sound like a dying, rusty organ. One, who was sent in 1892 at the age of 12 for laughing at inappropriate times and unseemly gestures, whispered in a nursing home, "She made us hold granulated sugar on our tongues. If you swallowed before the bell chimed 3 times, your head would be dunked in a tub of salt water until you couldn't breathe." The other mentioned a pale blue light, the smell of honey, and small masks worn when the wind changed direction. Most of their memories seemed to dissolve in a fog. It was unclear what was real and what was a product of sedatives and decades of trauma. In 1991, a major storm, with an unusual tidal surge, damaged much of the paper archives of the main religious historical society. In the pile of soaked records, only one sealed envelope survived. Inside was a yellowed page titled Coastal Screening Report, Spring 1893. Next to each girl's name was a symbol and a column labeled Formability Potential, Domestic, Committable to Asylum, Not Viable. Next to the name Edna Jo Kay, age 13, it read, Reef Rock, Not Revertible, Prolonged Mutism, No Return, No Discharge Record, Not to be mentioned again. That same spring, the sand dunes north of the convent were built higher. 4 new salt bushes were planted, right at the foot of the wind-blocking wall. Beneath each bush, the soil was strange, compacted, mixed with salt ash and eroded shards of pottery. Decades later, in an effort to preserve the convent's ruins, a secret drawer was discovered in Ilara's bedside table. Inside was a half-burned rosary and a piece of rough cloth embroidered with 7 X's in red thread, 1 X for each unrevertible girl. Ilara was never put on trial. She died in her bed in 1908, her lungs filled with fluid, her lips stained the dark brown color of sedatives. No one claimed her body. There was no eulogy, but the last line she wrote, tucked between page 127 to 3 of her personal songbook, was still clear. Some gifts must be buried to be considered pure. His name was Dr. Heinrich Klein. He came from Cincinnati, under a false name, signed in blue ink on the employment records of the Coastal Women's Morality Society. The diplomas he carried claimed he had studied neurochemical balance in hyperactive women in Munich in the post-Franco-Prussian War era. However, no immigration or academic records confirm this. The only thing that was confirmed was his shadowy history of transfers, medical stations in New Hampshire, a nursing home in Vermont, and a now nameless children's reform camp in Ohio. Each posting ended with complaints of incorrect dosages and a lack of treatment records. In late 1885, Klein was invited to St. Bridget's Orphanage to take on the role of formula supervisor, a title described in his recruitment letter as one who formulates mixtures to enhance feminine virtue, maintain a state of internal order, and inhibit improper emotional displays. In reality, he created something else entirely. In 2007, during a geological survey of the island's coast, researchers discovered nearly 34 fragments of glass bottles under the collapsed rubble of the old warehouse. Many fragments still bore faded, handwritten labels: Tonic B, Daytime, Anti-Panic, Nightly Obedience Serum, 4C, Temperament Adjustment, Dosiförung Year-Old, Morning Dew Solution, Speech-Slowing Version. Chemical analysis revealed that these mixtures contained chloral hydrate, laudanum, and mercuric chloride, a neurotoxin that was warned against even in 19th century medical literature for causing long-term memory loss, hallucinations, and motor impairment. This was not an experiment. This was a form of chemical erasure, systematic, funded, and purposeful. The girls at St. Bridget's Orphanage were given these tonics as part of what was called their daily spiritual reorientation regimen. Some drank from silver spoons in the chapel, beneath the rotting crucifix and the sound of the wind howling from the sea. Others had it dripped onto their tongues as they slept. A deep sleep, filled with the murmur of hymns, mingling with the sound of the tide striking the stone. An internal report, found in a wooden crate, mislabeled Seaweed Harvesting Equipment 1894, revealed Dr. Klein's clinical assessment. It included this passage: "The supplementary solution has produced the desired reduction in verbal resistance. Individuals classified as reef rock became inert approximately 36 hours after the first dose. Most ceased active eye contact. Some fell into a state of continuous recitation of Psalm 38 for 4 days. No rest, no sleep. Some girls reacted violently. Gums bled, bodies convulsed, like beached fish. Those were marked for rotation to the salt marsh, a phrase historians now believe was a euphemism for disposal. Beneath the dark mud, deep in the dead seagrass, residual levels of mercury and opiates were found, the only trace of the forgotten names. To control the dosage, Klein devised a cruel but effective method. He concentrated the medicine into small crystals, then coated them in sugar cubes, distributed to the girls during breakfast or after each singing practice. Some children mistook the sugar for a reward. Others soon sensed something was wrong and refused to swallow. To counter this, Klein drafted a proposal. It is now held in the Maine State Archives. The final passage reads, "If sugar is seen as mercy, we must teach that it is obedience. Hunger will reinforce the lesson. Those who refuse to swallow will quickly learn to forget." As a piece of seashell, discovered during an excavation of the island's edge in 2008, with shallow and crooked carvings, provided a rare glimpse from inside the convent's saltstone walls. The words, scratched with a rusty pin, "The sweet ones sleep first. Their eyes forget to close. Their prayers are mixed up." Dr. Klein never wrote letters home. He lived in a stone shed, attached to a greenhouse for growing parsley and dried algae. He rarely left it, except for dosage checks, but he left behind extremely detailed, cold, and coded handwritten records. In one surviving leather-bound notebook, Klein graded the girls according to their submission gradient, a term he borrowed from seaweed grafting techniques. The highest score was recorded as follows: Subject J, age 11, completely flattened by day 5, does not speak, eats when instructed, blinks to the metronome signal. An ideal baseline model for the next batch. Oh, in the margin, a smudged pencil circle enclosed the phrase, "Quattro che più piano, uguale a optimal." That combination, sedative 4C, followed by hymns played on an old harmonium, was later called the lullaby protocol. After each session, a few girls would sit motionless in the stone courtyard, eyes wide open, lips murmuring nonsensical melodies as if they could still hear the music. There are signs that Klein tried other additives, digitalis, microdoses of arsenic, and sedatives used for marine mammals. One compound was tested on rabbits in the convent's basement. None survived more than 4 days, but the girls, they were given no choice. In the last surviving inventory, dated autumn 1893, Klein requested 7 dozen glass vials for dispersal along the algae garden. That same week, 4 new saltbush beds were planted near the northern fence. No map recorded the change, but to this day, nothing else will grow in that soil. Klein disappeared in the spring of 1894. No forwarding address, no resignation letter, only a train ticket marked for Portland and a crumpled piece of paper written in German left in his notebook drawer. When translated, it read, "They no longer scream. Now only the sea remembers their sound." It's easy to assume they all fell silent, that the girls at St. Bridget's Convent were too young, too sedated, or too terrified to fight back. But that isn't the whole truth. A few of them tried to escape. Their names never appeared in the repatriation records, but their absence was still present. In disciplinary logs with faded erasures, in beds that were suddenly empty, and in brief notes like, "Subject absconded, increase medication during prayer hour, seal the embankment area." Between 1886 and 1895, 12 escape attempts were noted in internal records. Most ended the same way. The girl was recaptured, covered in moss and mud, her lips swollen, either completely silent or screaming as if she had seen something no human should see. Afterward, she would be moved to the shell carving cellar, a phrase that became a euphemism for what you know was the final isolation ward. But 3 girls never returned. No record, no reclassification, no report of a body found, only a sharp increase in sedative prescriptions the following week, as if their disappearance was not something to be investigated, but a deeper, more intentional form of silence. The most famous of these cases was a girl the sisters referred to only as the girl in the window. Not because she escaped through a window, but because from the night she vanished, that window pane was never dry again. The second floor of Dormitory D, overlooking the bay, had a small glass pane that was always fogged from the inside, regardless of the season. In a photograph taken in 1913, when the building was being prepared for transfer to the Catholic Church of Portland, the photographer noted something strange. Small handprint, fingers unusually splayed, a smear of blood trailing into a curved comma. Room faces south, unclaimed, according to a page torn from the November 1891 enrollment book. That bed once belonged to a girl named Marble J., age 14. She was committed for refusing to name the father after a suspected out-of-wedlock pregnancy, a claim that was never verified. In the only surviving record, Marbell was described as thin, pale, skinned, with unusually bright eyes. She lasted 6 weeks. On her last night, an internal report simply stated, Hymn 47 interrupted, mid-session prayer cut short, window open, 1 set of linens missing, empty Bible cover discovered under the bed, whereabouts unknown. Insing, but that was not the end of Marbell's file. In 2009, during an independent research project by local historians, the old foundation of St. Bridget's Orphanage was partially excavated. Beneath the cracked tiles of the old laundry room, where the uniforms and linens for Dormitory D were once processed, they discovered a wooden box with a broken lid, hidden deep in a crawl space, just tall enough for a child to squeeze into. Inside were 6 items, each one silently evoked a buried voice. A horn comb, its edges worn, with the initials MJ burned into the handle with a metal tip. A strip of old muslin, hand-drawn with black ink into a simple map of hallways, stairs, and cellar doors, with a red thread stitched into a dashed line leading toward the sea floor beneath the chapel. A rotting Bible, hollowed out. The first 10 pages had been torn away. A small copper spoon, the bowl faintly engraved with the words, "Don't taste the sweet thing." A small glass vial, its neck broken, still containing brown residue inside, and a sprig of dried white clover tied with a strand of sea strawberry vine, the kind that once grew low at the edge of the convent's backyard. Whoever Marbell was, she didn't just run, she left a map, and someone followed it. 3 weeks later, a girl named Rosalie W., age 12, was found trying to crawl under the tool shed to the west, an area that had been sealed since 1904, after a mold fire inside. Rosalie's mouth had been sewn shut, not with medical thread, but with rough twine, hastily knotted, as if stitched in the dark by a child's own hands. When the nurse found her, she couldn't speak. She just shivered, clutched her stomach, and pointed toward the cliff behind the convent, where a path had been overgrown with moss. Rosalie died 3 days later, from sepsis. In the attending physician's final report, a vague note was added in red ink. Stomach contains rough, woven fabric, wax residue, and pine splinters. Victim appears to have attempted to swallow a hand-sewn object. No newspaper reported it. No one was investigated. But the back garden was tilled 3 days later. All soil samples were said to be for growing herbs for the kitchen. Years later, during an effort to restore the old chapel, under the stage floorboards, where the organ and confessional once stood, a hymnal was found, its spine broken. Between the pages were 5 red stitches, sewn through Psalm 34, and only 1 verse underlined in pencil. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. That page had been folded 4 times, into the shape of a 5-pointed star, a star with a bloodstain on one edge. They were not nurses, they were not nuns, though they appeared in the convent. They wore no habits, they carried no crosses, and they never spoke during prayer hour. But every girl in St. Bridget's orphanage knew who they were: Martha and Agatha House, referred to by a single title, the Sisters. They arrived in the fall of 1886, after a fire burned down the small orphanage they had run in Edgecliff on the rocky shores of Quincy, Illinois. On paper, it was a candle accident, but a memo from the Quincy courthouse, filed and quietly dismissed, once noted 3 girls were never found in the ashes. The Society of Overseas Moral Women did not question it. They even praised the sisters for their silent devotion and steadfast dogma. Just a few months later, Martha and Agatha were appointed as dormitory disciplinary supervisors under the direct authority of Eunice Shepherd. No one ever photographed them. The only remaining image is a damaged tintype found later among a pile of damp pastoral records. 2 women in grey dresses, standing behind an iron chain-link fence. Both their faces are blurred by light, as if deliberately obscured by time. Each had a hand on the shoulder of a single child sitting between them. A child who was not smiling, eyes wide, expression unreadable. Their methods were never written down. It wasn't necessary. They were carved into the spines of the girls, into the forced curves of their backs, into the nameless bruises under dark shawls. Silence, numbness, disappearance. In a memo found in a ledger titled Dormitory Procedures, Windstorm Season Rotation 1889, there is a brief entry, noted in a slanted script. 1 knock, all sound ceases. 2 knocks, kneel. 3 knocks, follow. To not obey was to disappear. Behind the old warehouse, once used for drying holy cloths and storing anointing oil, was a narrow door, painted the same color as the mossy stone wall. No handle, only a thin slit, like a keyhole, less than 2 fingers high. The girls didn't call it a room. They whispered its name, the Hollow, according to a scrawled line found on the back corner of a damp, moldy hymnal. The Hollow contained a bench, too short to lie on, too narrow to stand, no window, no air, no time. No map recorded it, no records, no warrants. No one acknowledged it. But in 1998, during a project to reinforce the foundation of the rear chapel, engineers found that space, still intact. Inside, a broken copper spoon, its edge sharpened, as if by scraping stone, a strip of milk-colored cloth with 6 small parallel lines, as if marking time, a fragment of a coarse wool blanket, embroidered with a single word in pale pink thread. Still, the room was no larger than an upright coffin. A narrow slit cut near the ankle level was probably for passing food, or for letting someone know that someone was still inside. The house sisters' habits were not random. In Agatha's personal Bible, discovered in 2007 at a thrift store in Nebraska, a rotating punishment schedule was written in a slanted script with reddish-brown ink. 3 hours kneeling on salt, 3 days fasting, only ice water, 3 hymns repeated in the dark. Below, in smaller letters, don't let them sleep until the prayer dies in their throats. The 2 sisters slept up high, in a nook carved into the wall near the ceiling of the main dormitory. Their beds were bolted directly to the stone, without mattresses. Under each bed was a small wooden box, each labeled with a year. Most of the boxes were empty, but the box marked 1892 contained 17 hair ribbons wound into coils like barbed wire, a set of baby teeth wrapped in charred hymnal paper, and a small card of stiffened cloth written in German, Graylings. No one knew what Groylings meant, but in a hand-stitched journal, hidden by the girls under the raspberry patch in the west garden, the word appeared 7 times. One passage read, "Ruth became a Groyling last week." Agatha laughed when the Groyling didn't cry. Martha said, "Groylings don't have graves. They are planted." By 1894, even the long-term staff at the convent began to keep their distance from the 2 sisters. In his final formulary log, Dr. Heinrich Kleene wrote, "The sisters proposed a permanent reduction of light in dormitory B. They said, 'The pupils dilate faster when no one knows you are watching.' I refused, and I will not go into the garden anymore." He disappeared in the spring of 1895, leaving behind a train ticket to Portland and no farewell. The last surviving document about Martha and Agatha is not in the internal records. It was in an unsent letter found in a winter clothing donation box at St. Dunstan's Church in 1978. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting pressed so hard it seemed carved with a nail. It read, "They don't need the knocks anymore. They know before we arrive. Last night, the one with the red palms stood on Agatha's bed. We burned her things in the ash pit by the fence. Agatha does not open her eyes. Martha does not breathe. The roots are full. The children are singing again. They are no longer afraid of us." May. In 1896, the two sisters were transferred without charges, without a concluding file. The Society of Overseas Moral Women simply announced that they had retreated to practice their faith in quietude. No one knew where they went. But in 1922, in the long-term psychiatric ward of Augusta Hospital, an unnamed female patient, registered only as MH, was found using the back of her hand to write letters on the wall of her cell, with blood from a pulled fingernail. When asked, she said, "Their names. I used to carry their mouths on my back to cross the garden." She died 2 days later. Under MH's mattress, a thin hymnal was found. The last page was torn out. The hymn, "Be Still My Soul," was crossed out with red ink. In its place were 3 handwritten lines. "Be still, their voices. Be still, their fight. Be still, those who know of the night." Her name never appeared in the official records. No admission entry, no date of birth, no medical schedule, no signature in the chapel register, not a single line in the tonic log. She was a blank space, a silent shadow, drifting through the cold stone corridors, known only by the mark of her needle. Later, the survivors, the ones who found the cloth book sewn and buried under the oldest mulberry tree by the eastern garden wall, would call her by an unofficial name, the seamstress. We believe she once could speak. Before being put into the crevice the girls called the hollow, a line scratched into the underside of an old porcelain sink, found in 2001, read, "The tongue stops moving after the hollow." Her fingers were deft. That was undeniable, because starting in late 1892, someone, we believe it was her, began to sew. Not shirts, not bed linens, but memories, secrets, a living map of pain, forbidden to be spoken aloud. The materials, scraps of muslin, stolen from the laundry room, quietly cut corners of pillows, pages of hymnals, torn as cleanly as if by a razor. Red thread, strawberry vine thread, a few stitches made with human hair. A total of 32 cloth pages were found in 2007, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a child's leather satchel under the old laundry floorboards, next to a fragment of a female pelvis. The content inside could not be categorized by any archival system. This was not a diary, not a letter. It was living proof, a resistance, stitched in silence. Some pages were just a network of red threads, like tree roots. Others had distinct shapes, a figure kneeling before a grey wall with a slit, believed to be the hollow, a spoon with an X as large as a finger, a woman's face, her eyes crossed out with 8 overlapping red stitches, 9 hand-sewn windows, one completely torn away. Page 14 is where language reappeared. "The sweet ones sleep first. The groylings do not return." End quote. The word groyling also appeared in the journal buried under the strawberry patch, understood to be the girls who had permanently lost their voices and had no graves. The last page was the most terrifying, a crudely embroidered map of the garden, 7 red knots, each numbered. Beneath it all was a single word, stitched with human hair. Still, forensic analysis confirmed that most of the thread was cotton, but 3 pages were stitched with protein fibers, human hair, fine strands, dark. Some believe it was the seamstress's own hair, others believe it was the hair of the groylings, and that the book was not a legacy, but a doorway. The girl never appeared in any escape or burial records. Her name was not on the student list, no attendance roll, no reassignment notes. But under the same old mulberry tree where the cloth journal was unearthed, archaeologists discovered a child-sized skeleton, missing 3 fingers from the right hand. Lodged between the ribs was a sewing needle. The metal was rusted, but the red thread was still wound around the shaft, as if refusing to rot. The discovery of the child's satchel and skeleton drew national attention. The Maine Historical Society, researchers of collective memory, and even descendants of former staff at St. Bridget's all returned, in search of answers. Some claimed it was a fabrication, a form of shocking media art, but others, those who had grandmothers, aunts, or sisters who had disappeared without explanation, disagreed. No one makes up fear like this. No one embroiders roots and erased eyes just for a joke. And then, in 2012, something happened that silenced all doubt. On an abandoned farm 80 kilometers from the Institute, while dismantling an attic ceiling to lay new wood, a woman found a second cloth journal, the same size, the same stitching style, the same strawberry vine thread tying the edges. Inside were 7 new pages, and on one page, a sentence was embroidered directly with gray thread. "If you find me, they won't. They don't like red. They bury the red." In the bottom right corner, 2 letters stitched in pale thread. MJ Marvel, the girl in the window. That meant the seamstress hadn't just recorded. She had taught others how to record. No one knows how these cloth pages were secretly stitched, hidden, and circulated. No one knows how many more exist, buried under gardens, roof tiles, chapel floors, or inside the cracked walls of memory. But now, people understood. She was not forgotten. She was living memory. And those who had been silent were now still speaking, with red thread, with cloth folded into stars, with blood. At first glance, the mulberry garden behind St. Bridget's orphanage looked unremarkable. Just rows of scraggly trees with dark berries leaning with the sea wind. But the ground beneath them was always different. It was softer, as if it never fully dried. It gave way easily, as if waiting for a small foot to step on it again. And in 1902, when the Institute officially closed, a final worker wrote in a letter home, "The earth at the end of the garden feels like it's breathing. I swear, at night, I hear something shifting under the trees." No one dared to dig, not officially. The garden was abandoned. Seagrass grew tangled in the roots. The mulberry branches twisted together into strange spirals, as if contorted by hands that had once screamed without being heard. It wasn't until 2007 that an independent research group granted access to the abandoned Institute grounds to map Maine's coastal history, finally excavated the garden. What they found was not in any diocesan record, not marked, not reported. 12 mulberry trees, 12 depressions, each tree unnaturally fruitful, even in winter. Each depression was covered by a layer of moss as soft as a sponge, and every time the soil was turned, a faint, fishy smell arose, like old blood in salt water. 7 shallow graves were discovered. No headstones, no coffins, no names. Grave 1, the bones of a girl, about 11 years old. Her hands were tied with muslin. A copper spoon was wedged in her jaw. Grave 2, 2 skeletons, joined at the shoulder, as if they had been embracing at death. One skull was severely dented. Grave 5, a rusty metal tag, engraved with the words, "Groiling number 12. Grave 7, no intact skeleton, only tattered shreds of red-threaded cloth, the same kind used in the seamstress's cloth journal. None of the bodies matched the Institute's records. No death certificates, no mortality reports, no priest's signature, and no one, not a single person, had asked questions. The state of Maine halted the excavation after the 7th grave, citing risk of landslide and seawater contamination. But the photographs had already leaked. In them, small rib cages, contracted as if recoiling from pain, red thread wrapped around finger bones like ghoulish wedding rings, and a small hand, with only 4 fingers remaining, clutching a rusty needle. A state archivist, who remained anonymous, whispered, "There are still over 24 more graves, but no one wants to unearth something that once knew how to scream." But that wasn't the end, because among the small bones, an artifact was found, something that silenced the excavation team for an unusually long moment, as if the sea wind itself had stopped blowing to look at it. A folded piece of muslin, stitched with red thread. Inside, a tree, a spoon, a door, and a single word embroidered with stitches so jagged, so painful, they looked like blood had dried between each fiber. Still, the same thread, the same embroidery style, the same final symbol from the seamstress's journal. There was no longer any doubt. These graves were not just burials, they were rituals. Each tree was not just planted, it was offered, placed just so, its roots sunk into ash, blood, and a vow never to be spoken, not for shade, not for fruit, but to press down on memory, to eat through the earth, swallow through the roots, and turn cries into eternal silence. But they had failed, because the girls had left something the wind could not erase. They stitched themselves together with red thread. They drew maps with blood and scraps of cloth. They taught each other to hide names, to remember, and to exist in memory. Their voices did not disappear, they just changed form. It is in the rhythm of a spoon tapping on cold teeth, in the crack of a door where the wind whistles like a whisper, in the mulberry trees that bear fruit out of season, as if each berry is an unspoken word, and somewhere, under an old tree, another cloth page may still be waiting to be unearthed. A sign, a red thread, an answer not yet rotted away, still here, unheard, but still here. They called themselves the Society of Overseas Moral Women, founded in 1879 by an informal alliance of New England bishops, Puritan-style reformist nuns, and a group of post-war neurophysicians. The society declared itself the last line of defense for the moral fabric of the seaboard. On paper, their mission was noble: to care for orphans, to reform wayward youth, to restore the spirits of fallen souls near the sea. But the reality was different. What they built was not a network of salvation, it was a machine of subjugation, a system to soften, to blur, to make disappear. St. Brigid's Convent was not their first institution, but it was the most effective, depending on how you define effective. Granted land by the state of Maine, discreetly funded by coastal Baptist and Methodist congregations, and erected on an isolated island, where the fog was thick enough to erase even the sound of crying. They didn't call the girls patients, they didn't call them prisoners, they called them by a strangely sacred phrase: souls undergoing purification. From 1,891 to 1,920, the society held 14 admission councils, hearings conducted in the stone chapel, where files were read like evening scripture. They weren't looking for criminals, they were looking for deviant moral tendencies, weakness, curiosity, prominence, and the degree to which one could be molded. A faded internal memo reads, "Too intelligent, remembers for too long, scratches strange symbols in the dirt, refuse admission, pregnant out of wedlock, unrepentant accept, child of African and Irish parentage, accept without condition." No one audited, no one asked, and no one questioned why these convents only had entries and no exits. The society had a top-secret subcommittee. It did not appear in any funding reports or church minutes. It was mentioned only in double-locked shorthand notes at the Coastal Religious Archives under the vague name Sub-Division 5. Their role was not care, education, or prayer. It was moral, biological selection. Subdivision 5 was tasked with assessing moral degradation of genetic origin, behavioral instability, mental deviance, and tendencies to violate social structures, not based on pathology, but on skull shape, gait, gaze, and responsiveness to medication. They did not work alone. They collaborated with itinerant doctors from Boston, Baltimore, and later Providence, bringing with them early versions of Christian eugenics. St. Brigid's Convent became a laboratory, not for medicine, but for the moral limits of biology. The girls were classified, broken shells, unfixable. They didn't rebel, they didn't vandalize, they just didn't bow their heads. They looked straight ahead, or carved shapes on seashells with their fingernails. Some had memories that were too good, some never cried, some never spoke, but knew how to carve triangles, spirals, dots, and hide them behind the stone wall facing the sea. Punishment was not written in ink. It was mixed into porridge, injected into bodies, dripped onto tongues, long-term sedatives, muscle-softening solutions, the silence medicine, and in at least 31 documented cases, sterilization. No letters sent home, no notification papers, only hurried lines in the corner of a ledger, stabilized with salt water, unsuitable for community reintegration, unresponsive to chloral hydrate marked black, full moon taken to the sea. In a ledger sealed with red wax, marked Brigid Archive, Section 5, Genetic Correction, a chilling quote was found. God's earth must be tilled with virtue. Deviant sprouts must be cut, so that the future can stand tall on clean stone. It was a handwritten quote from a daily prayer book found in the Society's sealed archives. Below it, signed simply with 3 letters, EBM, Ilara Brigid McConnell, the first Mother Superior of the convent. Most of the founders of the Society of Overseas Moral Women did not live in seclusion. They became bishops, local newspaper editors, public health advisors, and one even had a statue erected in the courtyard of Harvard Medical School with the inscription, Pioneer of Moral Genetics. Their names appeared in textbooks, in churches, in school parks. No one mentioned St. Brigid's Convent. It wasn't closed due to scandal. No indictments, no trial, not a single newspaper line, just a cold note in a Maine State administrative document dated the 5th of February 1925. Operations temporarily suspended due to structural damage after a major storm. No plans for reconstruction. Then it faded, like chalk in the rain. But its legacy did not. It floated in stories told around fires. It lay deep in attics, in cold stone recesses, in carved seashells, in muslin scraps hidden behind stone walls, and in the unyielding memory of girls no one named. And then, in 2015, the unexpected happened. A descendant of a nun who had served at Brigid, an elderly woman living in Gloucester while liquidating her ancestral home, donated a hand-locked cedar chest to the New England Historical Society. Inside a layer of tattered oilcloth was a bundle of wax paper tied with red hemp thread, sealed with wax bearing the symbol of a winged cross. It was the secret correspondence between members of Subdivision 5, records never before known, never in any file, and completely uncensored. One passage left the entire archival team speechless. Of the 94 subjects processed, 11 have demonstrated the ability to retain memory and resist through symbolism. The red thread seamstresses must be monitored. They stitch memory back together. They pin truth into the fiber. They had known. They were afraid, not of screams, not of rebellion, but of needles, the clumsy but determined stitches, the small muslin squares, the secrets embroidered into the hems of towels, the bottoms of shifts, the edges of pillows, the seashells, carved with symbols no one could decipher until nearly 100 years later. Because truth, pinned into fiber, does not rot like paper, it does not burn like ledgers, it does not dissolve like medicine, it is not washed away by the waves, it lives. It slips into the cracks of history, and every time a girl traces a red stitch with her finger or touches a seashell carved with a star, she speaks again. The storm came on the night of the 29th of October 1925. Fishermen in the town of Morrow's Inlet, a small community along the rocky bay of eastern Maine, said they heard the waves roar differently around midnight. Great gusts of wind hissed through the pines, carrying the sharp smell of salt and something acrid, like old algae and iron-rich blood. Around 2 a.m., flashes of light erupted from the sea, but no one saw lightning strike, just white halos reflecting up from the seabed as if something was shuddering awake. By dawn, St. Brigid's Convent was gone. No chapel, no dormitory, no bell tower, just a jagged stretch of sand, littered with shells, broken rock, and a black ink-like spiral trail leading from the cliff down to the sea. The report from the local Coast Guard, sent 3 days later, recorded the scene as a total structural collapse due to a vortex of unknown origin. No bodies, no belongings, only a section of cracked granite foundation and a bronze bell warped and wedged in a pile of tattered coral on the bay shore. No investigation was conducted. No indictments were filed. Only a single line from the statement of the Society of Overseas Moral Women published in the Portland Herald. An unexpected storm has taken an institution that served the faith with devoted sacrifice. May the souls of the departed find peace. They did not rebuild. They did not return. And for decades afterward, no one dared to speak the name of St. Brigid's Convent again. But not everything was washed away. In 1973, a group of amateur archaeologists surveying the cliff strata around the west shore of Morrow's Inlet found an intact section of a cellar wall buried deep beneath the rock debris. On the stone, faded but still legible, were symbols carved by hand with a blunt tool. They drowned our names. We gave them back to the waves. And next to it, a second line, smaller, more scratched, perhaps written with a seashell or a wooden spoon. She called the storm the one who carved the shells. End section. It is believed this was Lyra, or one of the girls who learned the language of shells from her. No survivors were officially recorded, but years later, an anonymous old woman appeared at a memorial service in Portland, wearing a necklace with a spiral seashell and a small piece of muslin stitched with red thread, on which was written, "We were sunk, but we were not silent." That, today, whenever the tide recedes, strips of fractured seashells are exposed from the wet sand, stretching northward like a map. The locals call it the talking mouth of the sea. No one touches it, no one dares to dig it up, because they believe the sea is telling a story, and it is not a story for the living. Nearly half a century later, the autumn of 1972, the coastal wind had changed direction. The seagulls flew lower. The sand at Morro's Inlet began to settle softly into the rock hollows that were once the foundation of St. Brigid's Convent. On a foggy morning in early October, an elderly woman appeared at the small bus station in town. No one knew where she came from. She was thin, wore a grey coat, and had woolen gloves stitched with red thread. One was frayed, as if it had been bitten through. She did not sign her name in the boarding house ledger, just paid with crumpled old cash for a room overlooking the sea. All night, she stood by the window, without lights, without speaking, eating nothing but heated water. The landlord recalled. Her eyes looked like she had seen everything before, as if she knew exactly what was sleeping under the sand. Before dawn the next day, she left town, carrying a heavy cloth bag, a small bronze trowel, and a handwritten map smeared with salt water. No one went with her. No one stopped her. She was seen following the old cliff path, past the whispering pines, to the remaining foundation tiles, where the convent's sewing workshop once stood. There, she dug, not to find, but to bury. At the base of the west wall, where the beds of the broken shell girls once were, she knelt in the cold wind and buried something carefully wrapped in oilcloth. She covered the spot again with her bare hands, tying a sprig of dried algae around a rock at the base. Then she disappeared. No one saw her leave. The room she left was undisturbed, with only one thing out of place. The small mirror in the bathroom had been turned to face the wall. 20 years later, in 1992, during a coastal erosion survey, a research team from Bowdoin College accidentally discovered a strangely hard block of earth under the wall's base. Beneath a layer of fossilized sand and broken oyster shells, they found a small ebony box, carved with a spiral. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a silver spoon engraved with the letter L, a strip of muslin sewn with 4 windows in red thread, one marked with an X, and a wax-sealed letter with no addressee, only the words on the envelope, "For the one who will listen." It took years to decipher. The sewn cloth pieces, once dismissed as religious symbols or needlecraft, gradually revealed a complete system of narrative recording. Each motif, a spoon, a window, a seashell, a wave, corresponded to an event, a punishment, a name, a location within the convent. The girls had built an entire language of memory with needle and thread, silently, but persistently, right under the eyes of their keepers. In 2021, a team of linguists and forensic historians from the University of Maine published a discovery they called the Red Thread Diary. They didn't find it in books. They found it in rotted bed linens, doctrinal embroidery panels, shell carvings, and scraps of muslin hidden in the western wall of the old convent, the one that had borne the brunt of the wind and waves. They called it a stitched chronicle of systematic abuse, silent resistance, and memory that could not be buried. No words were needed, just cloth, a needle, and the color red. Each symbol was cross-referenced with artifacts, with leaked medical journals, with the scattered remains in the salt-soaked earth. Every cell, every cellar, every girl who disappeared, everything once dismissed as fisherman's lore, now became historical fact. St. Brigid's Convent was not a spiritual recovery facility. It was a disguised moral laboratory, operated by an obsession with purity and fed by silence. When the findings were published, the state of Maine issued a formal apology. The religious organizations involved remained silent. There were no lawsuits, no compensation. No one admitted to ever having known, but that no longer mattered, because in a small gallery in Portland, They hung up those pieces of cloth, every thread, every loop, every stitch made by candlelight. Above the wall, a small line was embroidered in red thread. We spoke with fabric when our mouths were no longer allowed. Visitors cried, children fell silent, and old women, those who had once been called difficult, who had been medicated, who had survived, began to tell their own stories. A new generation quietly traced the raised stitches with their fingers. It was no longer fear, it was recognition. Next to the final piece, the one embroidered with a wave and a broken silver spoon, was a small plaque carved from wood that had drifted onto the Maine coast. We did not drift away, we were sunk, but we left a way out, a door that can no longer be closed. Not by the sea, not by medicine, not by silence, because someone stitched and someone remembered. And if you are listening to this story, what are you thinking? Let us know in the comments.